You already know the word, bubble. You have heard it used about houses, about tulips, about internet stocks, about whatever the thing was that your cousin would not stop talking about at Christmas. This is the story of where that word comes from. And the first surprise is that the company at the center of it barely treated anything at all. In its entire life, the South Sea Company sent a handful of ships. Its real business was the national debt of Great Britain. And in the summer of 1720, with its share price climbing toward £1,000, its directors went to Parliament and got a law passed that made it much harder for anybody else to start a company. That law is remembered as the Bubble Act. It was written to kill their competition. Weeks after it was enforced, their own share price collapsed. The weapon worked. It just pointed the wrong way. Nobody in this story invented a product. Nobody discovered anything. The whole machine ran on one idea that a share is worth whatever the last person paid for it, and the men running it understood that idea better than anybody alive. It starts with a war Britain could not afford. The War of the Spanish Succession ran from 1701 to 1714, and it did to Britain what long wars do to every country that fights them. It won territory. It cost money that did not exist. By 1711, the government owed something in the region of £9 million that was not funded by any regular tax. £9 million in 1711. I am not going to convert that into today's money, because those conversions are always a bit of a lie, and you do not need the conversion to feel the problem. What you need to know is the shape of it. The debt was not one debt. It was a mess of separate promises made to separate people at separate interest rates, some of them for life, some of them redeemable, some of them not, and the Treasury could not get out from under any of it. Think about what an unfunded debt actually meant for the people holding it. If the Crown owed you an annuity for the rest of your life, you had an income, but you had nothing you could do with it. You could not sell it easily, because who would buy it, and at what price, and how would they check that it was real? You could not borrow against it comfortably. If your circumstances changed, if a business failed, if a husband died, if a daughter needed a dowry, the paper in your drawer was worth exactly the payments it would make whenever it happened to make them. It was wealth you could not move. And from the government side, the mirror image was true. Each of those separate promises had its own terms, its own interest rate, its own end date, and some of them had no end date at all. The Treasury was not managing a debt. It was managing several thousand individual arguments, forever. The man holding this problem was Robert Harley, and Harley had a very specific constraint. He could not simply go to the Bank of England, because the Bank of England was politically aligned against him, and because it held an exclusive charter as the only joint stock bank in England. That charter was a wall. He could not build a rival bank. So he did not build a bank. He built a trading company. In 1711, the South Sea Company was created, with the financier John Blunt as the practical architect of the thing. On paper, it was a company for trading with the Spanish colonies of South America. In reality, its founding purpose was financial engineering, and the trade was the story you told about it. Here is the mechanism, and I want to go slowly because everything that follows is built on it. People holding those messy government debts were invited to hand them in. In exchange, they received shares in the South Sea Company. The government then owed a single, tidy, lower rate of interest to one single company, instead of owing an unmanageable spread of obligations to thousands of individuals. Everybody got something. The Treasury got simplicity and a lower interest bill. The debt holders got a piece of paper they could actually sell to somebody else, which their old annuity was not. And the company got a guaranteed income stream from the government, plus a monopoly it could advertise. Notice what has just happened, because this is the part that gets lost in every retelling. The South Sea Company was profitable before it ever traded a single thing. Its income was interest paid by the British state. The South Sea part was decoration. And the decoration mattered enormously. If Harley had stood up and said, "I am creating a vehicle to reschedule the national debt," he would have been describing an accounting exercise, and nobody queues for an accounting exercise. Instead, the prospectus offered the South Seas, Spanish America. Silver, gold, ports on a coastline most people in London could not have found on a map and had heard about their whole lives. That combination is the invention here, and it outlives the 18th century by a very long way. A boring, reliable, government-backed cash flow at the center. A magnificent story wrapped around the outside. The cash flow makes it real enough to survive scrutiny. The story makes it grow. 2 housekeeping things, and then we get to 1720. This episode is history, not investment advice, and I am not comparing anything in it to anything you might be looking at today. And there is a harder note coming in the next act that I am not going to dress up, because dressing it up would be its own kind of dishonesty. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war, and Britain came away with something it had wanted badly: the asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. The South Sea Company was handed that contract. The terms, as recorded, were an exclusive right to supply in the region of 4,800 enslaved people a year for 30 years, alongside permission to send 1 general trading ship annually. I am going to say the next part plainly rather than sliding past it. The great financial romance of the 18th century, the origin story of the word bubble, the thing written up in 100 cheerful books about market psychology, was legally founded on human trafficking, not as a rumor, not as a dark aside, as the contract, as the asset on the balance sheet. And here is the detail that makes the whole enterprise stranger. Even that business barely functioned. The trade was choked by Spanish restrictions, by war resuming, by the sheer difficulty of the thing. The 1 annual ship was, in practice, a handful of voyages across the company's whole existence. So the South Sea Company had a monopoly it could not really use over a trade that was morally indefensible, and it made its money from British government interest payments instead. And yet the asiento appears in every prospectus, every pamphlet, every conversation about the company for the next 7 years. Why would you keep advertising a business that is not working? Because it was never being sold as a business. It was being sold as an option on a business. Spain was in decline, the colonies were vast, the restrictions were surely temporary, and one day, the ports would open properly and whoever held the contract would own the trade of half a hemisphere. You did not need the trade to happen, you needed it to remain plausible. That is a very specific kind of asset, and it is worth naming because you will meet it again. Its value lives entirely in the future. It cannot be checked in the present, and every year that it fails to arrive can be explained by circumstances rather than by the thing being wrong. There is no number you can point at to prove it false, which means there is no number at which enthusiasm has to stop. That is the company. That is the thing that in 1720 was briefly worth more than most of the productive economy of England. In 1719, the directors made a proposal so ambitious, it is still difficult to believe it was accepted. They offered to take on essentially the whole of the remaining national debt. Not a slice, the bulk of it. Bonds, annuities, the irredeemable long annuities that had proved impossible to shift. All of it, converted into South Sea shares. In April 1720, after a bidding contest with the Bank of England and after payments to people in a position to help, Parliament said yes. Now, here is the engine, and if you understand this, you understand the entire bubble, so stay with me for 90 seconds. The conversion was not done at a fixed exchange rate. Holders of government annuities exchanged them for South Sea shares valued at the going market price. Read that again, at the going market price, which means the higher the share price, the fewer shares the company had to hand over to settle the same annuity. Say a man holds an annuity, the company must settle with 1,000 pounds of stock. If the shares trade at 100, that is 10 shares out of the company's pocket. If the shares trade at 400, it is 2.5 shares. If the shares trade at 1,000, it is 1 share. Every share the company did not have to give away. It could sell for cash at the same inflated price. So the directors of the South Sea Company were not merely people who benefited from a rising share price the way any shareholder does. They were people whose company mechanically manufactured profit out of the rise itself. The price was not a measure of the business. The price was the business. And once that is true, everything the directors did next stops looking like madness and starts looking like a plan. They lent money to people so those people could buy South Sea shares. The company's own money out to buyers to bid up the company's own stock, which increased the value of the collateral, which justified lending more. They sold shares and subscriptions where you paid a small fraction down and owed the rest later, which meant a modest purse could command a large position and demand ballooned accordingly. They paid generous dividends out of capital rather than out of earnings, because there were no earnings worth the name, and a dividend is a wonderful advertisement. And they made sure, this is documented in the parliamentary inquiry that followed, that stock ended up in the hands of members of parliament, ministers, and courtiers, often with no money changing hands at all. Shares were recorded as sold to people who had not paid for them, on the understanding that they could sell them back later and pocket the difference. If the price rose, they were rich. If it did not, they had risked nothing. You cannot design a more efficient way to buy a legislature. The people who would have to approve your scheme were paid in the rise of the thing they were approving. Now watch what the number does, because the number is the whole drama. In January 1720, South Sea stock sat at around 128. By the start of April, it was around 300. By the start of June, it was around 800. By August, it passed 1,000. From roughly 128 to over 1,000 in 7 months, on a company whose actual commercial operations were a few ships and a contract it could barely execute. And I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story is that everybody went insane. They did not. Most of the people buying were behaving with a certain grim logic. They were not buying a business. They were buying a rising price on the correct observation that it had been rising and on the reasonable expectation that they would be able to find somebody to sell to. That is not stupidity. That is a bet on other people, and for 7 months, it was the best bet in England. What made it feel safe was who else was in it. Members of parliament, peers, the court, clergy, physicians, and shopkeepers and widows living on fixed annuities who had been quietly told that this was the way out of a life of temptation. When the people who write the rules are visibly buying stops feeling like gambling. It starts feeling like joining. And there is one more thing holding the price up that has nothing to do with belief. And it is the detail I would put in front of anybody who thinks a mania is just an emotion. The company was lending people the money to buy its own shares. If you cannot pay, the company will advance you the funds secured against the stock you are buying with them. That is not enthusiasm. That is a supply of new buyers manufactured on demand by the party with the most to gain from there being new buyers. And each subscription round tightened it further because you did not even have to pay the whole price. You put down a fraction, you owed the rest in installments, and you controlled a full position in the meantime. Which is why, by the summer of 1720, the buying was no longer coming only from people with money. It was coming from people with access to credit, which is a very much larger group and a very much more fragile one. Now, this is where the word you started the episode with actually comes from, and it is not from the South Sea Company at all. Around the Great Rise, an entire undergrowth bloomed. Through the spring and summer of 1720, dozens of new joint stock ventures were floated in London, some real, most not, all feeding on the same appetite. Companies for insurance, for fisheries, for importing walnut trees from Virginia, for draining fens, for trading hair, for a wheel of perpetual motion. Londoners called them bubbles. That was the contemporary word, not a metaphor about a market, an insult about a company. A bubble was a thing that looked solid, could be admired at arm's length, and was nothing but a surface with air behind it. The word we now use for an entire phase of an economy started life as a piece of London slang about dodgy share issues. The most famous of them is the venture supposedly floated by a promoter who advertised a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is, took subscriptions in a single morning, and was never seen again. I have to be honest with you about that one. It is the single most quoted line in the history of financial folly, and it appears in accounts written well after the fact rather than in the records of 1720. Treat it as a legend that describes the mood accurately rather than as a receipt. The mood itself is not in doubt. The dozens of ventures are documented. People genuinely bought them. And I want to defend those buyers for a second because they get laughed at across 3 centuries, and the laughter is a bit cheap. If you were a London shopkeeper in June 1720, you had watched the most respectable company in the country go from 128 to 800 in 5 months, with the Chancellor of the Exchequer's name attached to it. Given that, buying a fishery scheme is not lunacy. It is pattern matching. You had just been shown, by every authority available to you, that this was how money now worked. But the undergrowth was a problem for the men at the top. Every pound going into a walnut tree scheme was a pound not bidding up South Sea stock, and their whole engine depended on that price continuing to climb. So in June 1720, Parliament passed the Bubble Act. It required a royal charter for the formation of a joint stock company. In practical terms, it made the rivals illegal. The act is often described as an early piece of investor protection, a government stepping in to stop the public being fleeced by perpetual motion wheels. Read it in sequence, and that reading gets very hard to sustain. It was passed at the request of the largest speculative company in the country at the moment of its greatest political influence, and its effect was to clear the field of everybody competing for the same money. And in August, the act was enforced against several of the little companies, which is the moment this stops being a story about greed and becomes a story about a mechanism. Because the enforcement did something the directors do not appear to have modeled at all. Here is what the directors did not think through. To enforce the Bubble Act against the little companies, you have to declare that their shares are worthless, which is exactly what happened. People holding those shares were suddenly holding nothing. But those people had frequently bought the little companies with borrowed money, and a great many of them had also bought South Sea stock with borrowed money. When one side of that position went to zero, the loans were called, and the only liquid asset left to sell was the good one. The South Sea directors had spent the summer teaching the entire market to buy on credit. In August, they detonated the credit. By the end of September, the stock was at around 150. By December, around 124. Back to where it had started the year, and for anyone who had borrowed to buy at 800, very much worse than where it had started because the debt did not fall with the price. Understand what that means in a country with no deposit insurance, no bankruptcy protection worth the name, and a debtor's prison. It was not that fortune shrank. It was that the mathematics of a household inverted overnight. You owed money you had borrowed against an asset that no longer existed. The sword blade bank, the bank most entangled with the company, could not meet its obligations and went down. Credit seized across London. Members of Parliament reported constituents ruined. There were suicides. The company's own cashier fled the country, taking with him the detailed knowledge of exactly which shares had gone to which politicians, which is not the behavior of a man who thinks the books will bear inspection. And here's the thing about a crash that the price chart hides completely. The people hurt worst were not the speculators at the top. The speculators at the top were, on the whole, wealthy men who lost paper gains and stayed wealthy. The people destroyed were the ones who came in late and came in borrowed, which, because of how the summer worked, meant clerks, tradesmen, country gentry, widows who had converted a safe government annuity into a share certificate on the advice of everybody they trusted. Think about that conversion for a moment, because it is the cruelest part of the whole design. The original scheme took people who owned a boring, unglamorous, guaranteed income from the British state, and it persuaded them to swap it for a share in a company. A great many of them did that swap in the summer, at the top, because the exchange rate was set at market price and the market price was magnificent. Which means the closer the price was to its peak, the less stock they received for the annuity they gave up, and the more completely they were ruined when it fell. The machine was at its most efficient at extracting from people at exactly the moment it was most dangerous to be extracted from. And the thing that had held it all together for 7 months, the belief that somebody else would pay more tomorrow, did not degrade gradually. It is not a spring, it is a switch. On the way up, the price was proof the price would rise. On the way down, that same logic ran in reverse at exactly the same speed. What happened next is the part that almost nobody tells. And it is the reason this episode is in a series called The Great Frauds, rather than a series about manias. Parliament did not shrug. In 1721, a committee of secrecy sat in closed session from February through June. It went through the company's books, and it found what the arithmetic already implied. Books had been falsified. Stock had been recorded as issued to people who never paid for it. Money had moved to ministers and members. John Isleby, The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second most powerful man in the country's finances, was found guilty of what the record calls the most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption. On the 9th of March 1721, he was expelled from the House of Commons and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Let that land for a moment. Britain put its own finance minister in the Tower over this. He was not alone in disgrace. Members of Parliament were expelled. A postmaster general implicated in the affair died before the inquiry could finish with him. The company's directors were required to declare their estates, and those declarations were then used against them. And I want to flag something about that inquiry, because 3 centuries later, it is the part that has aged best. The Committee of Secrecy did not sit to decide whether speculation was foolish. Everybody already knew speculation was foolish. It sat to establish a much narrower and much more useful question. Who was given stock? By whom? On what terms? And did they pay for it? That question has an answer. The answer is in the ledgers. And when the ledgers turned out to have been altered, the alteration itself was the evidence. There is a lesson in the sequencing that applies to any scandal you will ever watch unfold. The mania is not the crime. The mania is the weather. The crime is a specific set of transactions between specific named people, and it is found by reading books, not by having opinions. The estates of the company's directors were confiscated to compensate the victims, and a settlement in August 1721 redistributed roughly £2 million of recovered assets to stockholders. The rest of the wreckage was cleaned up by Robert Walpole, who engineered the transfer of much of the company's capital to the Bank of England and the East India Company, and who came out of the crisis as the dominant political figure in Britain. The man usually described as the first prime minister. The Bubble Act, passed in a summer to strangle competitors, stayed on the statute book for more than a century. It was not repealed until 1825, which means the main legal legacy of the South Sea Bubble was a law that suppressed the formation of ordinary companies in Britain for over 100 years, written by the people who caused the disaster to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with protecting anybody. There is one more person I have to bring in because you have probably heard his name attached to this, and the real version is better than the myth. Isaac Newton. 77 years old in 1720. Master of the Royal Mint, the most celebrated mind in Europe. Newton held South Sea stock early, and in the first half of 1720, he sold, and he took a substantial profit. That is the correct move. That is the move everybody says they would make. Then he watched it keep going up. He watched people he knew, people who were not, by any measure, his intellectual equals, becoming rich in a market he had just walked away from. And he bought back in at roughly double the price he had sold at. His losses are generally put at around £20,000. Scholarly work on his actual accounts has complicated the neat version of the story, and the precise figure is argued about. But the shape is not in dispute. He sold well, re-entered near the top, and was badly hurt. He is also supposed to have said that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. That quotation cannot be traced to him in his lifetime, and I am not going to hand it to you as if it were documented. Set it aside, because the true part is stronger without the quotation. Newton did not fail at arithmetic. Nobody involved failed at arithmetic. Newton was one of the most rigorous thinkers who has ever lived, and he still could not sit still while other people got rich in front of him. That is what the machine ate, not stupidity, patience. And notice the timing, because it is the whole thing. Newton did not lose money by being wrong about the South Sea Company. He lost money by being right about it early, taking his profit, and then being unable to live with what happened afterwards. The market did not have to beat his judgment. It only had to outlast his tolerance for watching. 2, 3, 4 months of other people's good news, arriving daily from every direction, in a city where there was nothing else to talk about. Whatever you think you would have done in 1720, this is the actual test. Not, would you have spotted that a company with no trade was overvalued? Almost everybody could see that, and many of them said so out loud, in print at the time. The test is whether you could have known it, said it, acted on it, and then sat still for one more season while the people who ignored you got rich. The most rigorous mind of the age could not. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a straightforward fact about what it feels like to be a person among other people, and no amount of arithmetic touches it. I do not want to leave you with a costume drama. So here are 4 things from 1720 that are directly usable, and none of them require you to believe history repeats. 1. Ask who profits from the price rather than from the business. The South Sea Director's income came from issuing stock at a high price, not from selling anything to anybody. Anytime you meet an enterprise whose economics improve because its own paper is expensive, you are looking at the same engine. It is a completely legitimate question to ask of anything. If the price stopped rising tomorrow, does the underlying business still make money? 2. Endorsement is not diligence. What made the bubble safe in the minds of ordinary people was not the accounts. It was the guest list. Parliament, the court, the clergy. And the guest list had been paid in stock. When you find yourself reassured because of who else is involved, that is precisely the moment to ask what those people were given to be involved. 3. Leverage decides how a fall feels. The price ended 1720 roughly where it started. That was survivable. What was not survivable was borrowing to buy at 800, because the debt does not fall with the price. The same round trip is a boring year for one person and a catastrophe for another, and the only difference is borrowed money. 4. Watch for the moment a player starts rewriting the rules instead of competing. The bubble act is the tell of the entire story. When the strongest participant in a market stops trying to win and starts trying to make the alternatives illegal, that is not strength. It is an admission that the position needs protecting. And it took 3 months to destroy them. That last one is the one I would keep. The South Sea Company was not brought down by regulators, or by a short seller, or by an investigative journalist. It was brought down by a law, its own directors wrote. And there is a 5th thing, which is not a rule so much as a correction, and it is the reason I wanted to make this episode at all. You have been told the South Sea Bubble is a story about crowds losing their minds. It is not. Or rather, the crowd is the least interesting participant in it. The crowd behaved the way crowds always behave when the authorities in front of them are visibly buying. The interesting participants are about 30 men who understood a mechanism nobody else had thought through. That if you settle debts in your own stock at market price, your profit is manufactured by the price itself. And who then spent a year doing perfectly rational things to keep that price moving? Lending, bribing, legislating. Manias are studied as psychology. This one was engineering, and the engineers went to the tower, which suggests Parliament in 1721 understood the difference rather better than most of the books written since. Next Saturday on The Great Frauds, we move from 1720 to a case that ended in a courtroom in our own lifetime, and one number, $65 billion. Bernie Madoff ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history for decades, in plain sight, audited, regulated, and repeatedly reported to the authorities by a man who did the arithmetic and could not get anybody to listen. The South Sea directors had to buy a parliament. Madoff did not have to buy anybody. He just had to be respectable. That is EP3. If this is the kind of story you want more of, follow the channel, because the whole series is being built here, one Saturday at a time.